My name's Ben Nimmo. I'm a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. I asked to be called Old Chap, but Old Chap is not a thing, so I'm a senior fellow. And I'm one of the founding members of the DFRLab, like Elliot. I've just got to say, DFRLab is the best team I have ever worked with, so it's something to be really, really proud of. It's my great pleasure to introduce Liz Wall, who's a journalist, a researcher, and she's a woman who's shown what it really means to stand up for your profession and your principles. So, Liz, welcome to Berlin.
Thank you.
We're going to talk about the 4 Ds of disinformation, which are dismiss, distort, distract, and dismay. You don't need to remember them now. We'll be doing this in more detail. This is a model that we use at DFRLab to analyze and categorize different pieces of disinformation. And we'll explain how they work, and we're going to give you some examples of this stuff in real life. Just before we go into those, 3 important caveats on the way we use these. First of all, as far as we know, this is not written down in any Russian General Staff manual of information warfare. This is not written down in the online trolls' book of trolling. This is a model which we have derived from studying disinformation. So just bear in mind when you see this, this is the way this works. The second point is that the examples we'll be drawing are all from Russia, because frankly the Russian government has given us so many examples. You could write a few books about this stuff. But these are not just techniques that Russia uses. I've seen China use them in the South China Sea. I've seen them used in both sides during the Brexit debate, and we should never get the 5th D, which is Donald. I've seen a lot of analysis where other people are saying Donald Trump uses the same skills. That's not because, as far as we know, he's learning it from the Russians. These seem to be the standard techniques which malicious actors use to launch their disinformation when they're attacking somebody who has criticized them. So these seem to be the building blocks of disinfo wherever it's coming from. And that feeds the third point, which for us, and certainly for me, is really the most important one. I developed the 4 Ds of disinfo as a predictive model. The whole point of these 4 Ds is that if you're about to bring out, for example, an analysis of human rights abuses in the Philippines, or if you've got evidence of chemical weapons attacks in Syria, or if you're going to report on election interference in Sweden, you can use these 4 Ds to predict the counterattack that you're going to get. This is what they do to us all the time. This is what they will probably do to you. If you know what's coming at you, you can defend against it a lot better. So please feel free, take this model away, use it to predict what's going to come at you the next time you expose something. With that, these are the 4 Ds. No, these are not the 4 Ds. These are Liz and Ben. This is us. This is us. There we go. Man who knows his own slide deck. This is the first of the 4 Ds. Dismiss. If you don't like what your critics say, insult them. Ad hominem attacks. Attack the witness. Discredit the witness. This is the single most common technique, certainly that the Russian propaganda machine uses, and in a lot of other countries as well. There are loads of examples. I'm sure you've all felt them. Who here has been insulted by the Russian propaganda machine already? Show of hands? There we go. There we go. Join the club. We should get T-shirts made. Just a few examples of some of my favorite ones. This warmongering has become good business for them. That was Maria Zakharova of the Russian Foreign Ministry talking about me, and Jonathan Isle, Dr. Jonathan Isle of the Royal United Services Institute, because we did a report to the UK Parliament talking about Russian disinformation. We're profiteers, and we're profiteering from warmongering. Well, if you believe that, why would you read what we do? Okay, it's an attempt to discredit us without looking at the evidence. Shout out to Elliot and all the Bellingcat guys in the room, the infamous investigative group Bellingcat, known for its fakes. That was the Russian Foreign Ministry, in their best diplomatic style. Another piece of McCarthyite hysteria. Go and search for the word McCarthyite on the websites of RT or Sputnik. It's all over the place every time anyone talks about Russian election interference. And of course, there's the word Russophobia. How many people here have been called Russophobes recently? Hands up. Lots of hands up. This is not a coincidence, guys. I did this chart at the beginning of the year. This is mentions of Russophobia by RT, Sputnik, and the Russian Foreign Ministry from 2001 to 2017. Anyone spot the pattern? You'd think Russophobia only came into existence after the annexation of Crimea. Russophobia is the standard term used to dismiss anybody who criticizes the Kremlin, you're not doing it because you believe in democracy or truth or accurate reporting, you're doing it because you're a Russophobe. That's the way the dismiss technique works. And of course, it's not just Russia doing it about Russia. Defending Assad, Russia cries fake news. I'm sure we can think of other political leaders who cry out fake news quite a lot. It's the dismiss technique. If it's fake news, then you don't need to talk about it.
Okay, moving on to the second D there is distort. So if you don't like the facts, you twist them. Distorting a story can range from misleading or to alt-right false fabrications, which Ben is going to get into in a little bit. So if you're going to distort a story, kind of saw this firsthand, you leave out the context. You can cherry pick certain facts or quotes or voices that further the narrative that you want to amplify. You also amplify certain pieces of a story to fit a desired narrative, even though if it doesn't portray the bigger picture. And another thing that Russian media is they're very good at is providing alternative theories. So if the prevailing theory, the one where there's more evidence being gathered behind, if it doesn't fit the Russian narrative, they will very quickly come up with alternative explanations. And a lot of times this comes in the form of conspiracy theories. And for those that are following politics in the United States, we're seeing that the use of conspiracy theories is something that has become moved from the fringe to the mainstream, and it certainly is successful. And unfortunately, we're seeing that populations all are vulnerable to being manipulated by these alternative theories and thinking that they are possibly real representations of reality. So in my experience, the crisis in Ukraine, the beginning of the war in Ukraine was the beginning of when Russian propaganda really took a turn from the worst. Arguably, it could have been seen as once another voice providing another viewpoint. But from my perspective, the crisis in Ukraine is when Russian propaganda became over this Russian television station, maybe providing another point of view, switched to an alt-right, or alt-right in some cases, an outright propaganda machine. It became more heightened, it became more aggressive, and it became more shameless in twisting the facts. So I have a video here that I compiled around the time of Maidan, when right around the ouster of Yanukovych and before the illegal annexation of Crimea. This is what the coverage looked like on a television station like RT.
To protect ethnic Russians, Moscow is considering the possibility of sending troops to the region. What will it take to peacefully settle the crisis? Well,
Ukraine is torn apart by revolution. As Western politicians cheered on Ukraine's Maidan, radical nationalist groups claim power across the country. In Crimea, ethnic Russians are now asking for Moscow's protection. Where is Ukraine's legitimate government? What will it take to restore peace and unity? And what are the chances outside forces will have to step in?
Crimea is on the defensive. Many in this autonomous republic in southern Ukraine, populated mostly by ethnic Russians, fear what happened in Kiev could bury their quiet way of life. But if you want peace, prepare for war.
This is the Crimea. There are two roads connecting the peninsula to the mainland, here and here. This is one of them. Two roads that locals say could become two gateways for undesirable forces from the north. And this is why they're here.
They fear that Ukrainian fascists pose a major threat. The country's ultranationalist right sector group helped topple President Yanukovych.
Yeah, so you can kind of see there the themes that were being pushed by Russian disinformation, the narrative that they wanted to present to the world. Some of it's very subtle. You have to be paying close attention, and unless you're somebody that is very interested in what's going on in Ukraine, or now what's going on in Syria, or how interference is happening in our very own elections in the United States and abroad, it can be very confusing for the average news consumer. But you can see there are some buzzwords that they used. Western politicians are backing the protests. They call radical national groups and fascists are gaining power in the country. So in that way, if you use those kinds of derogatory words to paint the Ukrainian opposition, it provides this, I guess, pathway or justification for the need for Russian troops to come in and rescue Ukraine from these fascists. And also ethnic Russians are now asking for Moscow's protection. We all know that that's, in this room, I think that that's not exactly what had happened there. And it was more of a Russian military invasion, as some people would say. So those are some of the subtle distortions of the narrative. Ben has more extreme examples where it's not minor distortions here and there, cherry-picking facts, but these are outright manipulations and distortions. Total fakes, as you might call them.
As the fifth D would say. Right, so up on the screen here we have a satellite image which was shared by the Russian Ministry of Defense shortly after the shooting down of MH17. So Malaysian Airlines flight MH17 shot down over Ukraine in July 2014. The latest finding from the international investigation team is that it was shot down using missile provided by the 53rd Air Defense Brigade of the Russian Army from Kursk. So we have a pretty tight definition of where this thing came from. The Russian MOD published this satellite image which claims to show, in box A there, 2 Ukrainian Buk missile launchers which happened to be in the site of the shooting down at that time. The Russian narrative being, as it has been for so long, it wasn't us, it was the Ukrainians. Now, thanks to the Bellingcat team, I'm entirely pinching this work from them, suspicions were raised about whether this photo was actually genuine or it was photoshopped. And so Bellingcat shared it with the arms control team at Monterey, whose Twitter handle is Arms Control Wonk, which is a much easier handle to remember than their actual title. And they ran it through a piece of forensic software called Tungsten, which highlights areas where a particular image appears to have been digitally altered. This was the result of the Tungsten scan. So the black patches are where you've had text boxes inserted. The yellow bits around the edges, the bright spots, are where you've had clear digital manipulation. So we're looking for the yellow as bits which appear to have been faked. What do we see in that red circle? The 2 bits which appear to have been faked the most are the 2 Ukrainian Buk launchers. Now, we don't have the evidence to prove that they were just photoshopped in there, but the finding from Arms Control Wonk was that this is so heavily manipulated that it is meaningless as evidence. That's not something from a blog. That's not something from a conspiracy site. That's something from the Russian Ministry of Defense. It looks very strongly like they have photoshopped a satellite image so they can say, wasn't us, it was Ukraine. Fortunately, there are people like Bellingcat and Arms Control Wonk in the world, because when you catch them doing things like that, it doesn't look very good for them. Another example, which is one of my favorites, one we picked up on last year. So in January last year, the US deployed the 3rd Armoured Brigade Combat Team to Europe as part of its European Reassurance Initiative, and it parked enough vehicles for another Armoured Brigade Combat Team in the Netherlands. Now, an Armoured Brigade Combat Team, if you Google it, normally counts about 96 tanks and about 1,800 vehicles. So if you add up all the vehicles that were there, you have about 192 tanks and about 3,600 vehicles. Most of these vehicles are trucks, Humvees, and trailers. Okay? Not particularly dangerous unless they've got a really bad driver. This wasn't a scary enough headline for the Donbass International News Agency, which is a rebel propaganda site in eastern Ukraine. So they just headlined it, US sends 3,600 tanks against Russia. They got the number right, 3,600. It's just that only 192 of those were tanks, and the other 3,408 were other vehicles. It's a clearly distorted headline. It's not the kind of mistake you make by accident. I think most people can tell the difference between a main battle tank and a trailer. So this is clearly a distorted headline which has been distorted to give a sensation of fear. Oh my God, the Americans are coming. What's interesting, given that this is such a second-rate piece of propaganda, is the spread of it. Here you can see DONI is the Donbass International News Agency. Initially, it spread to the usual suspects, those websites we all know and love, like Russia News Now and Before It's News, the kind of crazy conspiracy fringe of sites. But in the top left there, you'll see that it was picked up by RIA Novosti. That's the Russian state newswire, the sister of Sputnik. And then it was amplified out into the Russian-speaking world and to websites like Vesti LV in Latvia. So you have an entirely farcical story, which has been obviously distorted, but it's still good enough for the Russian state media. And that's something you often see with disinformation. What's important is not just where it starts, but how it spreads. The third D is distraction. If you're accused of something, accuse someone else of the same thing. This is the old Soviet whataboutism. And it's not about trying to have a rational argument, it's about changing the subject. It's about making you defend what you've done rather than actually focusing on what they've done. Russia accuses US of meddling in its elections. I mean, that's partly state-level trolling, but it's also all about changing the subject. Russia accuses the UK and the US of poisoning the spy, Sergei Skripal, to maintain Western unity. This is not a serious accusation. It's about changing the subject. This is a distraction technique. And here's a particular favorite of mine. So the latest report from the MH17, a statement said that it worked solely using images from social networks that have been expertly altered with computer graphic editing tools. The source for that statement, the Russian Ministry of Defense. Pot calling kettle black.
Yeah, and to kind of go along with maybe a recent example in the United States, we have this big immigration debate going on, and it was brought about by the Trump administration implementing this zero-tolerance policy, and now there's a lot of outcry with parents being separated from their families, and now it's kind of blame others for what you're being accused of, and he's saying it's the Democrats. And it works because some people are confused, and there's think pieces about, okay, are the Democrats responsible for this? It creates this whole other, distraction in which we have to consider something that is ludicrous or a non-thing. So it's putting chaos and misinformation out there that can muddy the facts of a certain story. And so the fourth D would be dismay. If you don't like what someone else is planning, try to scare them off. This would probably be one of the nastiest of the Ds. It really focuses on intimidation. We have some examples here. Oh, whoops, wrong button. Russia threatens to aim nuclear missiles at Denmark if it joins the NATO shield, so nuclear intimidation there. And the Russian leader makes nuclear threats to Norway for hosting US Marines. So in Russia's point of view, NATO, the EU, they don't like seeing unity there. They don't like seeing these forces being strengthened. So they do whatever they can to scare off any possible progress in these alliances being strengthened. So it can happen on this government level, but I think probably a lot of people in this room have had the experience of being trolled for their point of views, or if you wrote a think piece, or just trying to do an investigation into what it is that Russia really is up to. I think this D of dismay, you can see a lot of it play out online in the digital realm. Here, things like bots and trolls come into play. A lot of times, the Russian media and these bots and trolls and these fringe sites will seemingly work together. The level of coordination is unknown, but you do see that the similar narrative is amplified in all these different ways. So, and then it's using very disparaging words. You're neocon is one of them. You're Russophobic. You're a McCarthyite. You're a warmonger. All of these things. And one thing in my experience that I've seen is that they'll use real-world examples in which there's existing grievances. For example, the Iraq War was not popular, so a lot of times they'll shift it from you're a warmonger, just like in the times of the Iraq War. So and so a lot of times it's meant to scare somebody off, to intimidate someone, to silence someone, and to destroy somebody's reputation. So all these things are meant to scare off critics. So these 4 Ds can be used separately or together. One story, of course, that was not very good for Russia was the downing of the MH17 airliner. Overwhelming evidence pointed to the fact that pro-Russian groups were responsible for the downing of the aircraft, of that civilian aircraft. So just some examples here. MH17 report no clear answers means there's no smoking gun evidence. You'll see that a lot. Even when evidence is mounting, they'll say there is no evidence, show us the proof. And when proof emerges, sometimes they'll come up with their own manipulated examples. The MH17 disaster holds lessons for aviation, Ukrainian authorities, but apparently no lessons for Russia. Here, this headline accuses the investigators of being biased to kind of downplay their credibility. So when the findings do come out, it's unclear whether or not they can be trusted. So you can see some of these Ds in action in various forms here. So ultimately, I think the 4 Ds, the reason why they're effective, and as we've seen play out, let's say in the 2016 presidential election, that there is a very wide audience that is indeed vulnerable to these types of manipulation. The goal there would be to play on emotions. We see this not only in Russian media, but in highly partisan media and on social media, playing to this kind of clickbait emotions that verify your pre-existing beliefs, your existing political beliefs. Also to insert chaos and confusion, flooding the information space with so many alternative theories, contradictory facts, conspiracy theories that are meant to spread hatred and paranoia, and division. And so at the end of the day, I think one of the biggest goals is to make it so that a responsible party or a guilty party, that they're not held accountable. So those are the 4 Ds in a nutshell.
Great. So I talked about the 4 Ds as a predictive model, and indeed the main point and the reason I came up with this model is that so all of us who work in this space, we can know what the trolls are going to throw at us when we publish something. So please, 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 if you work in this space and if these are useful, take them away, use them to your heart's content. That's what they're for. There is another use, somewhat less formal, but if you've ever sat through a really, really boring press conference, let's say you've sat through Vladimir Putin's 4-hour direct line with the Russian people, you can use a chart like this one on the screens, and you can play bingo with the 4 Ds. You can spot them as they come up. If you're in a meeting with somebody who's using these a lot, you can have it in front of you and just tick them off. The 4 Ds can be great fun, and you can actually use them in real time to track the kind of disinformation which is being thrown at you. So if you want to enjoy them for those purposes, then again, be my guest. It's part of what they're there for. That's it for the 4 Ds: dismiss, distort, distract, and dismay.